Somewhere in your house right now, there's a guitar with two strings out of tune, a language app you haven't opened in 11 days, or a sketchbook with one decent drawing in it and 40 blank pages after it. You started. You had the fire. And then, somewhere around week 3, the fire went out. Not because you're lazy, not because you don't have the gift. It went out because nobody ever taught you how your own brain actually builds a skill. You were practicing like it's magic, hoping that enough repetition would eventually turn into mastery. But repetition without a mechanism is just motion. It's a hamster wheel with really good intentions. Maybe you've told yourself the story that some people are just wired for this. That your coworker who picked up conversational Italian in 8 months has some gene you don't. That the kid down the street who can already kickflip his skateboard was simply born with better balance. It's a comforting story, because it means the plateau isn't your fault. It's also almost entirely false, and by the end of this video you're going to understand exactly why. Somewhere out there right now, a person with less time than you, less money than you, and zero natural gift for whatever you're trying to learn, is getting better at that exact same skill, faster than you. It's not because they found some secret talent switch hidden inside themselves. It's because, whether they realize it or not, they're running the same neurological loop that expert learners have relied on for centuries. Once you see that loop, you cannot unsee it. And once you understand it, you can run it on purpose, for anything. In the next few minutes, we're going to break open exactly what happens inside your skull when a skill goes from clumsy to automatic, and why some ways of practicing barely move the needle while others physically rewire you within weeks. You'll walk away with a 4-step loop, built directly from neuroscience and cognitive psychology, that you can start using tonight on whatever you're trying to learn. An instrument, a language, code, a sport, a craft you've always wanted to pick up. It doesn't matter what the skill is. Your brain doesn't care. It runs on the same hardware every single time. Let's start by taking down the most famous myth in the world of skill acquisition, the 10,000-hour rule. You've heard it 100 times. Put in 10,000 hours at anything, and you become a master. Malcolm Gladwell popularized that number in his book Outliers, but he was borrowing, and quietly simplifying, the research of psychologist K. Anders Ericsson, who studied expert violinists training at a music academy in Berlin. Here's what Ericsson actually found, and it changes everything. It was never about the hour count. It was about what was happening inside those hours. The violinists who became elite weren't simply logging time, running through pieces they already knew how to play. They were doing something Ericsson called deliberate practice, working right at the edge of their current ability, isolating the specific weak points in their technique, with a teacher or a clear feedback loop correcting their errors in real time, over and over. 10,000 hours of comfortable, mindless repetition builds nothing but bad habits with excellent muscle memory. A few hundred hours of the right kind of struggle can outperform it by a wide margin. So what makes practice the right kind of struggle? This is where psychologist Robert Bjork's research at UCLA comes in, and it might be the single most counterintuitive finding in all of learning science. Bjork discovered that the practice methods which feel the easiest while you're doing them are usually the ones that build the least durable skill. He calls the antidote to this desirable difficulties. Rereading your notes feels like learning. Watching a tutorial for the 3rd time feels like learning. But that ease is often an illusion of fluency. Your brain recognizes the material, so it feels familiar, and familiarity gets mistaken for mastery. The moment you close the book and try to recall the information from scratch, or try to play the piece without glancing at the sheet music, the illusion collapses fast. That harder path, the one that makes you sweat a little and second-guess yourself, is the one actually carving the skill into long-term memory. If practice never feels a little uncomfortable, you're probably not building anything that will survive next week. Here's the part almost nobody talks about, though. The actual physical rewiring doesn't happen while you're practicing. It happens while you're resting. Engineering professor Barbara Oakley, who built one of the most widely taken online courses ever made on the science of learning, describes the brain as switching between 2 modes. Focused mode is when you're actively drilling a skill, straining at that uncomfortable edge Bjork described. Diffuse mode is a more relaxed, wandering state that shows up when you sleep, walk, shower, or just stare out a window doing nothing in particular. Diffuse mode is where your brain quietly connects the dots that focused practice laid down. And this isn't just a nice metaphor. Psychiatrist Norman Doidge, writing about the neuroplasticity research of neuroscientist Michael Merzenich, documented something remarkable. Every time you practice a skill, especially at that uncomfortable edge, your brain strengthens the specific neural pathway involved and wraps more of it in a fatty insulating layer called myelin. More myelin means the electrical signal traveling along that pathway moves faster and cleaner. That is the actual biological definition of getting good at something. It isn't a metaphor about talent or destiny. It's insulation, building up around a wire, one rep at a time. There's actually a much older piece of research that predicts this, one that predates modern neuroscience by over a century. In the 1880s, a German psychologist named Hermann Ebbinghaus ran a brutal series of experiments on himself, memorizing lists of nonsense syllables and then testing how much he'd forgotten hours, days, and weeks later. He plotted what's now called the forgetting curve, and it showed something that still holds up. Information fades fast unless it gets pulled back out of memory again, right around the point you're about to lose it. Cram everything into one sitting, and most of it leaks out within a day. Space it out, revisiting the material right as it starts to fade, and each retrieval resets the curve and makes the next one flatter. It's the same principle hiding underneath Bjork's desirable difficulties and Oakley's diffuse mode. Skill isn't built by one heroic session. It's built by returning to the edge of forgetting, again and again, on a schedule your brain actually respects. Now, if you want proof that this isn't just theory, that a brain can visibly, physically change shape in response to the right kind of practice, you don't need to look at violinists in a lab or a 19th century psychologist memorizing nonsense syllables alone in a room. You can look at London. Every year, a few thousand ordinary Londoners sign up for one of the hardest exams most people outside the UK have never even heard of. It's called the Knowledge, and it's what every London black cab driver has to pass before they're legally allowed to pick up a single paying passenger. The test requires memorizing around 25,000 streets and thousands of landmarks within a 6-mile radius of central London, and then being able to recite, from memory, with no GPS, no notes, and no hesitation, the fastest route between any two of them the moment an examiner asks. There is no shortcut through it. Applicants spend 2 to 4 years riding around the city on mopeds in all weather, building what they call mental maps in their heads, quizzing each other in study groups late into the night, and failing brutal oral exams over and over in front of unimpressed examiners. Most people who start never finish. It breaks people. But here's the part that turns this from a quirky British institution into a genuine case study in brain science. In the early 2000s, neuroscientist Eleanor Maguire at University College London scanned the brains of trainee cab drivers, then scanned them again years later, comparing the ones who eventually passed against the ones who dropped out along the way, and against London bus drivers, who navigate the same city but along a small number of fixed, repeated routes with no real need to build a flexible mental map at all. What she found reshaped how scientists talk about skill and the brain. The qualified cab drivers had a measurably larger posterior hippocampus, the exact brain region tied to spatial memory and navigation, than both the trainees who failed and the bus drivers who never had to do this kind of demanding, self-generated recall. And that difference wasn't there when they started. It grew during the years of training. Their brains had physically restructured themselves in response to sustained, effortful, desirable difficulty, the same mechanism Erickson and Bjork described from a completely different angle. These weren't people born with a freak gift for maps. They were former mechanics, retail workers, delivery drivers, ordinary adults with ordinary brains who put themselves through years of exactly the kind of struggle we've been talking about, recalling a route from scratch instead of glancing at a map, getting corrected by an examiner, going home, resting, and coming back the next week to do it again, a little harder than before. Their brains didn't reward talent. They rewarded the loop, run consistently, for long enough that the tissue itself had no choice but to adapt. So how do you actually run this loop yourself? on purpose, for whatever you're trying to learn. Let's turn all of this into something you can use starting tonight. I call it the deliberate loop, and it has 4 steps: isolate, strain, rest, repeat. The first step is isolate. Right now, whatever you're trying to learn probably lives in your head as one enormous, shapeless task. Get good at Spanish, learn guitar, learn to code. That's not a task, that's a category, and your brain has no idea what to actually do with a category. The first move is to break the skill down into its smallest teachable pieces, what learning researchers call chunking, and pick exactly one chunk to work on at a time. If you're learning guitar, don't practice guitar. Practice the transition between 2 specific chords until your fingers stop hesitating on it. If you're learning a language, don't practice Spanish. Practice the 50 words you'll actually use in your first real conversation, or one verb tense until it fires automatically. If you're learning to cook, don't practice cooking. Practice your knife cuts, or the exact moment a pan sauce needs to come off the heat. The isolation can feel almost too small to matter. That's the point. Small, specific, and correctable beats broad, vague, and unmeasurable every time, because you cannot get useful feedback on guitar. You can absolutely get feedback on whether your finger landed on the right fret in under a second. The second step is strain. Once you've isolated the piece, resist every urge to practice it the comfortable way. Comfortable is rereading, rewatching, replaying something you can already sort of do. Strain means testing yourself before you feel ready. Close the textbook and try to recall the vocabulary from memory, instead of just rereading the list one more time. Play the chord progression slightly faster than feels safe instead of slower and safer. Try writing the function from a blank file instead of copying the tutorial line by line. You will get it wrong. That's not a warning sign. That's the entire mechanism working exactly as it should. Bjork's research is clear that the discomfort of retrieving something imperfectly and then correcting it builds a far stronger memory trace than smoothly reviewing something you already half know. If practice ever starts to feel easy and pleasant the whole way through, you've drifted out of the zone that actually builds skill and back into the zone that just feels good in the moment. Chase the friction on purpose. The third step is rest. Here's the step almost everyone skips, usually because it doesn't feel productive. After a session of real strain, your brain needs downtime to actually lay down the physical changes, strengthening the connection, wrapping it in that myelin insulation we talked about earlier. Sleep does most of the heavy lifting here, which is exactly why cramming a skill the night before you need it barely works. It's also why spacing your practice out across several days, with genuine rest in between, consistently beats one exhausting marathon session. Give your brain the boring, in-between moments too. The walk, the shower, the drive with no podcast playing. Oakley's diffuse mode research suggests those unfocused stretches are when your brain quietly finishes connecting what the focused, strained practice started. Skipping rest doesn't make you learn faster. It just means you show up to tomorrow's session, dragging yesterday's half-finished wiring behind you. The fourth step is repeat and raise the bar. Once the isolated piece stops feeling like a strain, that's your signal. Not to move on entirely, but to raise the difficulty and loop back to step 1. Slightly faster tempo, a harder passage, a real conversation instead of a vocabulary list. A messier, bigger coding problem than the last one. This is exactly what happened inside the heads of those London cab drivers. Each new run they memorized was a little more complex than the last, forcing the hippocampus to keep adapting instead of coasting on what it already knew. To make this concrete, picture 3 completely different people running the exact same loop. A woman learning piano isolates a single 4-bar phrase instead of playing the whole song badly. She strains by playing it hands separately, slightly too fast, until she stumbles, then corrects the exact note that tripped her up. She rests for a day instead of grinding it for 3 hours straight. Then she repeats it at full tempo with both hands. A man learning to code isolates one function instead of trying to build the whole app. He strains by writing it from a blank file with no reference open, gets it wrong, and studies exactly where the logic broke. He sleeps on it. The next day, he repeats the exercise with a harder version of the same problem. A teenager learning to skateboard isolates a single foot placement on the board instead of attempting the whole trick. He strains by trying it slightly off balance, again and again, falling in a controlled, safe way each time. He rests his legs overnight. The next session, he adds the next small piece of the trick. Same loop. 3 completely different skills. Here's the identity shift that matters more than any single technique we've covered. Stop telling yourself the story that some people are simply naturals and you're not. The cab drivers weren't naturals. The Berlin violinists weren't naturals. What they had was a loop, run consistently, for long enough that their brains had no real choice but to change shape around it. Talent might buy someone a slightly faster start. It does not exempt anyone from the loop, and it certainly does not replace it. Think back to that coworker who picked up conversational Italian in 8 months, or the kid who landed his kickflip in a single summer. You weren't watching a gift. You were watching someone run isolate, strain, rest, repeat, probably without ever putting a name to it, probably without realizing they were doing anything special at all. The plateau you hit 3 weeks in wasn't proof you're not built for this. It was proof you were repeating without straining, or straining without ever resting, or trying to swallow the whole skill instead of isolating the one piece in front of you. Every time you choose the harder recall over the easy reread, every time you let yourself actually rest instead of guilt-tripping yourself into another exhausting session, every time you raise the difficulty instead of coasting on what already feels comfortable, you're not hoping to get lucky with talent. You're doing the one thing that has ever reliably built skill inside a human brain, giving it a reason to rewire itself. If you've stayed with me all the way to this final loop, you're probably not the person who watches videos like this for entertainment and closes the tab 5 minutes later. You're the rarer kind, the one actually willing to put in the strain, take the rest seriously, and run the loop again tomorrow even when nobody's watching. That mindset is worth more than talent ever was. So if this changed how you think about learning, drop a like, hit subscribe, and let your brain build one more pathway, the one that brings you back here for the next video.